Hi, this is Dr. Mora. Today we're going to be preparing a number 9 for an all-ceramic crown. That's going to be with a modified shoulder design, a 1mm finish line circumferentially. We're going to have a 1.5mm incisal reduction, 1 to 1.5mm facial reduction, and a 1 to 1.2mm lingual reduction. For this preparation, the views we want to see are a view for our interproximal separation, which is going to be a straight through view as seen here. Whenever we're doing a depth reduction on the facial surface, we want to actually be looking across that surface like so that you can see the depth of the burr going in. And then when we're working on the lingual, we're going to want to have the mirror as far away as possible to minimize water spray. We're going to put that mirror, once again, since we're cutting depth, we're going to be putting that mirror as far as we can over to the side here, and that's going to be the view for that. Whenever we're checking the depth reduction and the evenness of our finish line, we're going to be looking from an occlusal view like this. That way you can visualize the entire finish line and compare one spot to another. Today I'm going to be using this probe, which as you can see is marked with 0.5mm markings rather than 1mm markings. We're going to always keep in mind which direction our burr is rotating, and you can change this on your control screen. Rotation to the left is looking from the back of the handpiece to the left is counterclockwise. Looking from the back of the handpiece to the right is clockwise. So you're going to always want to be thinking about which way it's turning, because you'll notice that that influences the way the burr wants to roll when you touch the tooth. I'm going to be referring to this as moving with the grain or against the grain, that meaning that if the burr is turning to the right, like so, it's going to want to be rolling from right to left as that roll rolls it across the tooth. So we're going to want to think about whether we want to be rolling with the grain or against the grain as the burr is turning in that same direction. Whenever we're doing a bulk reduction of tooth structure, or we want to avoid the burr kicking us into the adjacent tooth, we're going to want to roll against the grain. And anytime we're doing small detail adjustment or smoothing, we want to be rolling with the grain. And you'll find that that makes a big difference for your control of the burr. One final point here is that anytime I'm working, I try to have two hands with solid finger rest support, two hands on the burr for maximum control. This is called the bimanual technique and will allow you to have the most fine control over your burr. I'm going to begin by doing the interproximal separation to minimize the number of burr changes that we need to do. I'm going to start with the mesial interproximal separation on number 9, and we're going to want to be going against the grain, meaning we don't want it to be kicking us into this tooth here, and that would be a leftward turn. So we want to be going right instead. So I'm going to set it to right. Now it's going to be going against the grain as we separate through here. The main objective with the separation is to reduce the bulk of tooth structure to make it easier to go through with our final burr. I move up and down to allow water to flow into the space to minimize burning. And I can even start on the incisal aspect, again keeping two fingers on the handpiece. Now all I'm trying to do here is to go straight through the contact. Okay. And leave a shell to protect the adjacent tooth. Continuing to the distal side, I'm going to switch the direction that my burr is turning so that I am still moving against the grain. I'm going to visualize the contact directly through. I'll start by adding just a little bit of a notch to give me some guidance. And you can see that my burr has no desire to roll into the adjacent tooth. And that is due to the direction the burr is turning. Next, I'm going to be placing my mock finish line. What this lets me do is to set the position of the finish line, almost like drawing on the outside edges of a shape in a coloring book. That way you can fill in the inside without having to worry about going outside the lines. This is very useful to let you put your finish line where you want it and then not have to worry about hitting that area. Go ahead and place this again at 200,000, and with bulk cutting, meaning I want to be going against the grain. In this case, that means I want the burr to be rotating to the right. For this, the burr is not necessarily lined up with the long axis of the tooth. I can angle it in just slightly. And I want to place it as close to the 0.5 millimeters above the gingiva that we desire as I can. I want to place this as close to the desired 0.5 millimeters as I can. 0.5 millimeters supragingival finish line, that is. And that way, there will be much less work required at the end for final adjustment. Check our measurement with our 0.5 millimeter probe. And that's going to be very close. Another good reason to place the mock finish line is that before you've set your finish line, that's actually the most stable the burr is going to be while cutting the tooth. So placing it that way, placing it as close as possible to the measurement we want, is easier than returning to that later. Next, I'm going to finish the interproximal reduction with my mod shoulder burr. I'm going to start with a bulk reduction of material so that I can have more control while I'm focusing on the details at the end. Just going to get it through the contact first. This is a green burr, 200,000, and again cutting against the grain. Being careful not to touch the adjacent tooth. And again, I'm going to place the finish line as close as possible to the 0.5 millimeter supragingival measurement we want, and it should have a depth of 1 millimeter. I'm going to go ahead and set that right away. We'll go ahead and move to the distal and do the same thing, this time changing the burr to rotate to the left, again cutting against the grain. Just making sure not to hit the adjacent tooth at this point, because I know I'm going to have enough clearance for that at the end, so I can go ahead and push it as deep as I need to clear that contact at the level of the contact. You may choose to wedge your tooth as you're working on it to get farther away from the contact, but as you can see with the given dimensions, it is actually not necessary. I'm not going to worry about the line angles at this point. I'm going to return for those later. Right now I'm just focusing on essentially prepping the buccal wall, the interproximal walls, and then it will be the lingual wall. We'll return for the line angles later on. I'm going to go ahead and set my finish line to my 1 millimeter axial reduction and 0.5 millimeter away from the gingiva to the final measurement. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and do the incisal reduction so that I have less axial wall height to reduce for my axial reduction. For this, I do not want to reach the final measurement of 1.5 millimeter reduction because the smoothing at the end of the preparation will reduce that significantly due to the thinness of the incisal edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and reduce 1 millimeter, which is the width of the end of this burr, and so that's what I'll use to gauge that. I can place the burr on the incisal edge so that I can feel the angulation that is, and I can match the anatomy. I'm going to go ahead and drop it in about 1 millimeter. I'll do depth cuts, several, just like so. So we have about 1 millimeter there, a little less than 1 there, and about 0.75 there. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce that. Now the way I reduce depth cuts is I cross them so that I do not drop into the depth of the depth cuts. This way I can use those struts that are in between them as a way to hold the burr out of the depth cut and reduce only to the depth of the depth cut, like so. Next, I'm going to make my facial depth cuts. I want to do them for both the long axis of the tooth and the second plane of reduction. And seeing our interproximal view, we can see that our long axis is approximately this way. So that's how I'm going to set it. And one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to make staggered depth cuts, which I'll show in a moment. That way you're able to tell the depth of each. Staggered for the long axis and for the second plane of reduction. For the second plane of reduction, just place your burr on that facial plane and you'll be able to feel that. And there's our long axis. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and set those to the final depth we want, which is 1 millimeter. We have some leeway here as it is 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters. We can check our depth groove depth by looking from the occlusal, and you can see that we can look straight down those depth grooves and see the depth that we've achieved. Keeping in mind the probe is 0.5 increments, that is a 1 millimeter reduction there, and a 1 millimeter reduction there. This was the long axis. Now I'm going to flatten it against the second plane of reduction. I'm going to place one depth groove here, and likely another one here. I look across the tooth so that I can tell how much depth I am going to. And here I'm aiming for 1, but again we have leeway space of 1 to 1.5. That looks like about 1. Okay, a little less than 1, I'm going to leave that one there. Looking from the occlusal, we can see our initial depth cuts in the cervical aspect of the tooth, and then rotating the mirror we can see the depth of our second plane of reduction depth cuts, which are just about 1, just under 1, which is perfect. As we smooth them, they'll reach 1. And we can see all 3 of them against the backdrop of those remaining tooth structure cervically, which is due to the staggering of the depth cuts. The thing that many people find difficult about depth grooves and why they may not like using them is because smoothing afterwards becomes an issue. As you move the burr across the depth cuts to smooth them, you dip into them and make the depth cuts deeper while leaving a speed bump in between them. How we're going to avoid that is by once again crossing the burr so that we can use the struts of remaining tooth structure to cage the burr away from the deepest point of the depth cut, and then as we reach that point, we'll stop cutting. This way you don't reduce the depth cuts any deeper and you go exactly to the depth of the depth cuts. The best way to see when you reach that deepest point is to take a mechanical pencil and to just go ahead and draw with your pencil at the deepest point of those depth cuts. And that way, with our diagonal burr, as soon as we begin removing that pencil at the bottom of the depth cuts, we'll know that we have reached our adequate depth. And you can see that as I reduce like this, the burr does not drop into the depth grooves whatsoever. I'm going to go ahead and remove a little bit more off of this one. And I want to do as much as possible with the green burr. I'm not going to switch to the red burr until the very end because these plastic teeth are very hard to cut with the red burr. In a clinical situation, the red burr can be used a little bit more because the red burr does cut the teeth, but with the plastic teeth it's very difficult to do so. So we're going to go ahead and reduce as much as possible, not all the way because we are going to be smoothing with the red burr here. Okay. And now that was the second plane of reduction. I'll go ahead for the long axis reduction. And the same way, I'm going to cage the burr across those struts of tooth structure. And now you can see why it's nice to place the mock finish line because we don't have to worry about where the tip of our burr is really. For that lingual view, once again, we're going to look in the mirror here on the lower left as far away from the water spray as possible. Zoom in here. I'm going to go ahead and place my finish line. Now because there's very little tooth structure here, it's not going to be a mock finish line, it's actually going to be our finish line. To work against the grain here, I'm going to be rotating the burr to the left, still at 200,000. Again, we want to place the finish line right to 0.5. We don't want to do anything that's going to require a lot of busy work to smooth it and adjust it. If you are cautious of going too gingivally or subgingivally, you can choose to place it a little bit higher than 0.5 millimeters supergingivally, but keep in mind that it will take a lot more work to reduce it down to where it needs to go at the end. By placing it where we want it the first time, we'll save ourselves a ton of time. We can check our finish line evenness by looking in the mirror from the occlusal view. We can see that the interproximal and the lingual are very close to where we want them. Yeah, we're about 0.5 away from the gingival everywhere. Once again, this is my lingual view. We'll be placing the mirror as far away as we can, and we're going to be changing our burr finally to the 1 millimeter depth cutting burr and keeping the depth cutting burr perpendicular to the surface that we're cutting. I'm going to go ahead and begin. And the more back and forth motions we do carefully, the less burning we'll have. That looks like just under 1. And the way that I'm going to ensure my depth reduction across the surface of the back is by adding kind of a T across. We're going to just go ahead and color in the depth of those depth grooves with the pencil. Using the green football on 200,000 here, I'm going to reduce the struts of tooth structure between our depth cuts. And now you can see why it's important to do those T's crossing mesiodistally, that surface, because as you approach the edges of the tooth, that needs a 1 millimeter depth reduction as well. Go ahead and get it smooth here, moving distally to mesially. We can check the evenness of our reduction at the finish line by looking from the occlusal. Once again, I can see here clearly that we have a 1 millimeter even finish line through the interproximal, keeping in mind the tip of this burr is 1 millimeter. So 1 millimeter finish line through the interproximal, on the lingual, as well as the mesial. The mesial is a little bit shy actually, but the main problem here which becomes obvious when we look from this view, is that the buckle is under reduced. So I'm going to go ahead and do my buckle reduction just straight across, and then I'm going to look again in order to adjust those line angles. So here we can see when we place the burr and we're looking across from this view that the tip of the burr is not all the way buried here. And so we're going to go ahead and take it to that point because the burr is 1 millimeter. And I'm always working from one side to the other with brush strokes, moving across. Okay, looking from the occlusal view here now, we can see that we have a much more even 1 millimeter reduction on the facial as seen with the width of the burr. It needs just a hair more, and we're going to get that when we go with our red diamond. Okay, and then the line angles right here and right here where it's very sharp need a little bit of adjustment. And go ahead and round this line angle. Now keep in mind, whenever you're adjusting line angles, because they're very sharp, they adjust very, very quickly, so I'm not going to overdo it here. Looks much better. Let's go ahead and do the distal. And when we look across that line angle, we can see that sharp spot right there. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to adjust the mesial here to be a little wider. So we can see that it's a little bit under the width of the burr. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that burr is all the way to full thickness. Right through there. So that's looking pretty good. We're going to switch to the red diamond and smooth everything out. Because we've set all of our measurements to where they need to go, we need very, very little adjustment with the fine diamond. I'm going to adjust everything on 20,000, and from now on I'm basically going to be brushing with the direction the burr is rolling. You can see that the pencil, as the pencil lines go away, we know that we've hit that depth exactly. And the burr takes away so little at this low speed of 20,000 that we can just do many strokes. Don't have to worry so much about our control. We'll go ahead and do a couple full strokes across just to make sure that we've got this grit across the entire second plane. And we'll go ahead and do our first plane. Got a couple little bumps here. Gonna smooth those out. Okay, now to smooth the sharp corners here, we begin with our burr parallel, and then as we smooth the corner, we change our angulation with each brush stroke to come around the corner and make it very round. I'm going to additionally smooth off the cingulum by doing the same method, parallel to the axial wall, and then rotating just slightly around. Again at 20,000 and rolling with the burr, like so. Changing my angle just a hair, just a little bit smoother now. We will go ahead and smooth off to the red grit with the football. I'm just going to work from top to bottom. And that way I'll know that I've covered the entire surface. You don't want to move sporadically around, adjusting little things as you see them. You want to do everything procedurally. And you can round these edges here just a little bit by rolling over them. That looks significantly smoother. And finally, before you evaluate anything, you always want to dry it off thoroughly We will evaluate the width of the finish line with the tip of our modified shoulder burr. We are just at 1, and approximately looks like 1, maybe just a hair under there, and we can adjust that. 1 here on the facial. Also, now right there, right in the mid facial, that is a common place for under reduction, and it looks like we do have a little bit of under reduction there. So we'll go ahead and adjust the mid facial and the distal right here. Okay, adjusting the mid facial, we can see where it is a little deficient. This is at 20,000 and rolling with the burr. That looks significantly better. We'll go ahead and adjust the distal where it is slightly under-reduced axially. We're rolling with the burr at 20,000, and I'm only pressing axially. We can adjust a couple other spots as we see them, and we can smooth a little bit. And that looks pretty good. We can always go with our Explorer and just make sure that there isn't any flash. There is a little bit of flash there, we can see. Let's check our finish line. Looks like we are at 1 now. Right here, where the burr is overhanging the finish line just slightly. And this time I did increase the speed just a little bit to 60,000, just so that I can get there a little more quickly. As our last step, we're going to check with our putty reduction guide. At the facial, we have between 1 and 1.5 with our 0.5mm probe. Okay, getting up to 1 right at the incisal edge. On the lingual, we require an axial wall height of 1.5 to 2 millimeters, and we can see that we have a 1.5 millimeter axial wall height. We required a reduction of 1 to 1.2. And we can see that we have a 1 millimeter reduction on the lingual in the area of the cingulum and in the area of the incisal. Now right in the center, in the deepest part, we are actually at only 0.75. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce that slightly. I'm going to take my pencil and just mark that spot. And finally, our incisal edge reduction, which we left shallow, 1.2. So we're going to go ahead and increase, just by rounding, increase that to 1.5. And that's why we left it for the end, because it's very easy to correct that. It needs almost nothing to get our reduction amount. I'm going to go around it and smooth it now. On the lingual, we can see our marking of where we were shallow. We're shallow by about 0.25, so very little, with the red diamond at 20,000. With the pencil mark, we can see that we're touching that area. I'm going to stay on that area until I feel it's been reduced enough. And we'll move up slightly. Okay, now we can see that we have achieved our 1.5 millimeter reduction on the incisal. Here we're getting a little under 1. And here especially we're under 1. That was from here all the way up to the incisal edge. As we can see, the small adjustments are actually the thing that is the most time consuming. That is why it's important to get your prep as close to the dimensions that you want it with your first pass of the instrument, so that you're not having to do a lot of small adjustments. Keep in mind, if we're under-reduced in the middle, we're probably under-reduced to the sides. So I'm going to go ahead and make wide movements. And finally, we have our final measurements, which are from 1 on the facial, between 1 and 1.5, 1.5 millimeter incisal reduction. And now to finish on the lingual side, our 1 millimeter reduction. The cingulum area is actually only a 0.5 millimeter reduction, which is unacceptable. This ceramic would be too thin, below the minimum required thickness there, and you could have fracture. And so we're going to do a little bit of adjustment there, We don't want to lose our lingual axial wall height, however, so how we're going to do this adjustment is we're going to actually use the modified shoulder to bring this line in slightly. That way we'll maintain our axial wall height by moving the entire axial wall, and then we can smooth with a bevel. Tilting slightly and moving axially. And adding a slight bevel by tilting our angle. We can observe the discrepancy between the angle of the outside of the tooth in the putty, like this, and the angle of reduction that we chose, like this. So what we actually will want to do is bevel it to match the external surface form. So I'm going to bring a burr approximately like this, and just bevel that there. And finally, after that adjustment, we can see that we have 1 millimeter reduction on the lingual and 1 millimeter reduction at that most narrow point, maintaining our 1 millimeter reduction on the lingual axial wall, as well as actually now increasing our lingual axial wall height from 1.5 to 2. So go ahead and taper that inward to match the external surface form. You're increasing your TOC slightly here, but it's more important to have the minimum ceramic thickness, and this will not put us over for TOC, especially because we are actually aligning with the external surface contour of the tooth, which is what we want. So that's our finished prep with the dimensions that we want. 1 millimeter modified shoulder finish line continuously around it, very even. A smooth prep reflecting the red fine grit diamond. 1 to 1.5 millimeter facial reduction, a 1.5 millimeter incisal reduction, a 1 millimeter lingual reduction, and a 2 millimeter lingual axial wall height, which gives us our resistance to displacement of our crown and our minimum required material thickness. So we can see from the occlusal here, and we can see with our direct view and evaluate our prep. Thank you for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.